recording. Okay, so with that, I'm still admitting some last minute folks, but I am going to go ahead and transition this over to Katie Sue. And then please, if you have questions, go ahead and place them in the chat. And then I will monitor those questions and we will answer them at the end, or at the end when we open it up to Q&A. If you want to come off mute and ask your question directly, you can do that as well. All right, Katie Sue.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for having me. I love Be a Tree with my whole heart, and I absolutely love getting to work with you. As she said, my name is Katie Sue. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a medical social worker who has a history in working for hospice, end of life, and I am now the program coordinator for medical aid in dying at Denver Health. Today's agenda, just so you have an idea of what to expect, I'm going to briefly touch on the overview of the law. I have a feeling the humans on this call know a little bit about MAID, so I won't go too deep into that, but happy to answer more questions. I'm going to also highlight the process, specifically as it relates to Colorado, because that's where I'm based, but it does pretty much follow this flow in all states. And then finally, the bulk of the presentation is I hope to offer you a little insight as to what happens on an ingestion day. I think there's a lot of questions and a lot of fears about what actually happens when you take this mystery cocktail, and I want to help offer it to the public to make them feel a little bit more comfortable with what to expect in that space, so that you can hopefully mitigate fear if you're in this field, or just know that your options are available when that time comes. So it definitely would love to answer questions. I'll try to kind of move through this information fairly quickly so that we can have more discussion. I absolutely love answering questions more than anything. So let's rock and roll. So just to start, the overview of the law. Generally, medical aid in dying is legal in 11 jurisdictions right now, including Colorado, which is where I live. It allows a terminally ill person with 6 months or less to live to access medication to hasten their death. The patient must make that request with full mental capacity. So having a cognitive diagnosis can affect your eligibility for MAID. And in most cases, it requires 3 requests: 2 oral requests via doctor's appointments and 1 written request. I will note that some states have more progressive and, I'll be honest, wonderful laws. Oregon is one. They do not have a residency requirement, so people that don't live in Oregon can access the law. They also have different rules regarding the wait period. In most states, you have to wait 15 days or a certain amount of time in between the 2 doctor's appointments. Oregon removed that. And New Mexico also has a pretty progressive law. They also have allowed nurse practitioners and PAs to prescribe MAID, which is huge. If you didn't think about it, in rural areas, the doctors aren't as prevalent. There's more PAs, medical assistants, nurse practitioners. So when there's no doctor nearby, it's really hard to access MAID. So it's wonderful that New Mexico offers that. They also have only a 48-hour waiting period between their 2 doctor's appointments. To talk a little bit more about Colorado, because that's my bread and butter, the law allows for terminally ill people to access said medication via a mandatory process. There is certain steps that we have to follow here in Colorado that can't be bypassed, which can be really frustrating for a very sick person. But the law in Colorado also creates criminal penalties for tampering with the medication, say, the medication gets in the wrong hands, or coercing a person to use the med. So there's good safeguards. Our law in Colorado also protects physicians by providing medication without penalty. So doctors can't be jailed or charged with anything because they prescribe this medication to an eligible patient. It also allows clinicians, doctors, nursing homes to opt out of the program without recourse, which is also important. This is a very big ethical question for a lot of people. And I do like that the law allows protection for those people to say, this is really not my stance, and I support you, but I can't support you in helping access it. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So that's the law in a little baby chunk. Happy to dive more into what that law looks like for certain states. But let's talk about the process. So to access medical aid in dying, I would say the hardest part is finding 2 physicians. So in Colorado, you have to have 2 doctors certify that you are terminally ill, that you have full mental capacity, and that you understand the consequences of this decision and that you have the right to rescind this decision at any time. For most people, that can be kind of daunting. I don't know a lot of people that have 30-year relationships with their physician. I know that's how the law originated. They were hoping, oh yeah, you'd go to the town doc that you've known for 40 years and you have such a good relationship that it's an easy conversation. But I myself have switched doctors 4 times in the last 5 years, so none of them really know me that well. So it's kind of scary to think about how I would choose that. The other process is you have to have a written request. So as I mentioned earlier, for medical aid in dying, you have to make 3 requests. 2 have to be those oral requests via the doctor's appointments. 1 has to be a written request. In Colorado, the CDPH does have a form that you can fill out, but most programs have forms specific to their program and their medical facility. So always make sure you check with whoever you're using MAID through. But it's just a form saying that I, Katie Sue, have this diagnosis. I understand the consequences of taking this medication. I understand this is my decision and my decision alone. And that's it. It's a very short paragraph. It's not meant to be overwhelming. And the important part about that written request is that it has to be witnessed in the presence of 2 witnesses. This can be the other hurdle for a lot of people. When you're terminally ill or even chronically ill, you may know how isolating it is. Your community starts to fade away. You are more isolated, especially in a global pandemic where you may not be getting out of the house very much. So it's really hard to find 2 people because the law also has another caveat. Those witnesses, they can't be your MDPOA or your healthcare team. Who are the 2 people you usually see when you're sick? Your MDPOA and your healthcare team. So it's really hard if those two groups are eliminated from signing the form. So for our program, and I'll talk a little bit specifically about our program, we have volunteers that can go and serve as witnesses. But it is important to note that those witnesses have to be in the room when that person is signing that form. They are not liable for anything. They're not liable for the person or saying that they support me. They're simply saying, I saw Emily sign this paper in front of me on the same day. And that's it. It doesn't need to be notarized. It doesn't need any kind of legal recourse. It's simply those witnesses making sure that you are indeed the person you say you are. So those are kind of the logistical hoops you have to jump through. To prove that you're eligible for the program, you also have to have a few documents. So before your first appointment, we typically ask for a few things. 1, we have our proof of residency is your Colorado issued ID. It's the easiest way to show that you're a real resident. You know, you pay taxes in some way, you have established a residence somewhere, and you had to go to the DMV, which I know sucks. But it is very easy for us to know that you're an actual resident of Colorado using that form. There is no minimum amount of time that you have to live in the state, though, before you can access MAID, which I think some people worry about. You do have to live here long enough to have some kind of established residency. For a lot of people, that can be kind of difficult, but we often accept other forms of residency. We will accept a lease agreement. I think the biggest example is a loved one moved from Florida to Colorado to be closer to her family and never got a new ID, but she has the lease from the building she lives at saying that she's a resident on this floor. That's perfect. Shows you're a resident. We also accept any kind of bills that have your name and address on them. So the electrical, even your direct TV, anything of that sort. And then we also even accept like renter's agreements. So even if you've only been here a month or so, if you have that official rental agreement, we can accept that as residency. So there are some options. So that's what we need, number 1, in order to book your appointment. The second form we need is called a CTI. It's a certificate of terminal illness. That is a document that is produced by hospice, and it's essentially the snapshot saying who you are and what your diagnosis is and why hospice, why now. There is a lot of overlap between hospice and medical aid in dying. We have the same eligibility of someone has to be terminally ill with 6 months or less to live, as well as just the need for those end of life resources. So it's a really convenient document for us to utilize. Never mind the fact that we typically coordinate quite closely with the hospice team, so it makes it really easy for us to start that communication by getting that form. We also request, they're not required, but we request a copy of your MDPOA. That's the medical durable power of attorney, just saying who we can speak to about this process because not everyone tells their loved ones about MAID. So it's good for us to know who's allowed to be informed. And then the final is the MOST form. You may have seen the MOST form before. It's a bright green form here in Colorado. In other states, it's also called the POST form, but it's the medical orders for scope of treatment. It's typically the document that says CPR or DNR. The reason we ask for that form is because we like to see that you've done kind of your research. You understand where you're at in your life. If somebody is a full code, as we call them, when they get CPR, full intubation on their MOST form, that means that they might not be making an informed decision about medical aid in dying. If they still want to be intubated, it doesn't make sense that they might be looking at medical aid in dying. So that's a really good indicator for us to make sure that we've offered the appropriate education. Something that comes up quite often is the question of how do you make sure that people are asking about other options or doing whatever it is they can before resorting to MAID. There's a huge worry that we are trying to eliminate the disabled community, that we are trying to offer an out instead of offering community resources, and that's not the case. We definitely dive really deep into their psychosocial assessment, and we look at their whole environment to make sure they have what they need. And even if we get to the first appointment and see that they may not be appropriate at this time, we work then with their community partners to make sure they do have the education or the resources that they may need to get that support. So that's really important. So those are the documents we ask for. Once we have those documents, we set up your first appointment. All of the appointments in Colorado are largely virtual. If they're not virtual, the doctor comes to you, which is really nice. There is some rumblings with the DEA that they're trying to remove the ability to prescribe narcotics like MAID meds to patients without an in-person visit. We honestly are trying to fight that. So if you have an interest in finding out more about protesting that decision, that would be great. We would love for your assistance and your voice, because again, our patients are very sick. Nobody wants to come to Denver Health when they feel good, much less when they're sick. So we very much appreciate the fact that we can meet patients where they're at in their homes without too much stress. If we force patients to come to our office, that's going to eliminate a lot of access for patients, because we see people from Colorado, which is out near Utah. We see people in the Springs and Canyon City, up in Fort Collins, and it would just be a huge burden for them to have to come into the office. So for now, everything is virtual, which is really nice. Once you have your 2 appointments and you're approved, the ball is rolling. You get your power back on the day of that second visit. So the second that visit is over, we send the script. Some people pick up the meds that day. Some people leave the script at the pharmacy, and it's just up to them. But then after those 2 visits, those 15 days, the patient gets their power back, which I find really, really important. To talk a little bit about where you get the meds, they are not available at your local King Soopers. Very sorry. This is not something that Walgreens can whip together for you. It is a specialized compound, and there's a few pharmacies that will make it. Here in Colorado, I can't speak to the larger nation, but I know that there's pharmacies in every state that has MAID available. But what we do here in Colorado is we have a couple of local contracts. If you utilize the Denver Health Program, it comes through our discharge pharmacy. But what I find the most helpful is we have a courier system through Penpole Pharmacy, and they can ship the meds directly to the patient's home. So I found that, again, has been a huge relief and a removal of an obstacle for patients who live in rural areas or don't have caregivers to go pick up their meds. So it's been really nice to be able to give them that grace and that delivery system. Let's talk about how you access it in Colorado, just really briefly. I don't know how many peeps are from Colorado on this call. But nationally, I would always encourage you to go to acamaid.org. I'm happy to send out these resources after the call too, but acamaid.org, they're the American Clinicians Association on Medical Aid in Dying. So this is their specialty. They have a referral program for doctors in your area. So you put in your information and they connect you with a local provider. So that's a really huge help. ACA MAID also has a referral system for doulas. So if you're looking for a death doula who's kind of skilled and trained in medical aid in dying, you can request their help there too, which I think is awesome. For Coloradans, I'm sorry I can't speak to the rest of the states, but there's a few options for accessing medical aid in dying. While I work for Denver Health, I love them. I'm a social worker by trade, and I like people to have options. I always want you to have agency in where you go or who you see. So here are some of the other places that you can access MAID besides at the Denver Health. Kaiser Permanente has a program. It's really wonderful. If you're a Kaiser patient, they can start to assist you. UC Health has a program. I haven't seen as much movement through that program, but you do have to be an existing patient. So talk with your provider to see if they can help you. And then finally, there's actually starting to become MAID boutique clinics. So they're specific physicians that have dedicated some of their time to helping MAID patients, and they're going to be available through the ACA MAID website. So just make sure you contact, say I'm in Colorado and I'm interested in learning about some of the different options for accessing MAID. Woo, that was a lot. Like I said, I want to spend the most of the time about MAID Day and what we do when we ingest, but I do feel like we had to lay down a little bit of a patio before we have our party later. So the final part I want to talk about is the meds themselves. So if you haven't heard about medical aid in dying, it is not pills. I actually just watched a movie on Netflix called Paddington. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty charming. Ray Romano is in it. Who knew? But it depicts two friends who are accessing medical aid in dying. And the movie is great until the MAID Day, because I think it creates a lot of fear. In the movie, he has to personally pull apart all these pills. That is not the case. So for Colorado, we use a compound called DDMAPH. It's a compound of very strong medications that we ground up for you, so you don't have to worry. It comes in an old school prescription bottle. When your time is ready and you're ready for ingestion, you'll add 2 ounces of liquid. It can be any liquid of your choice, just can't be dairy or carbonated. We ask that you shake it up really well. Some people put it into a glass or use a straw, but it can be stored safely for 6 months. So if you don't add liquid to it, it can sit on your shelf for that 6 months. Another addition that in Colorado, at least for our program, if the 6 months expires and you've had incredibly great days, you haven't needed the MAID meds, and you've outlived your doctor's expectations and you didn't need the meds in those 6 months, we will write you the script again. You do not need to go through the appointments all over. So we save you a little bit of that stress later on. I always tell people, if you're thinking about MAID, try to do the appointments as soon as possible. You can't start the appointments until you get that terminal diagnosis of 6 months or less, but make sure you're doing these appointments when you feel okay. It's really hard to have these really deep conversations with patients when they are in excruciating pain, or they're starting to actively die or transition, they're having seizures, and it's hard for everyone. So please, if you can, make sure that you're pre-planning and you know that your wishes are to do X, Y, and Z, so that when the time comes, you contact whoever. If that's me, I'd be happy to be here for you. But just make sure that you have those kind of in place before the time comes. Before we get into ingestion day, I feel like this is a good little stop off. Does anybody have a question about the law itself, the medications, or the process here in Colorado or elsewhere?
Feel free to come off mute or put it in the chat if you'd like to ask Katie Sue a question about anything she's covered to this point.
And no pressure if you're not ready.
Hey, Katie, this is Shani. I have a question. Regarding physician education on MAID, resources on how that assessment works, what paperwork needs to be filled out, et cetera. Is there a resource that you can provide for that?
Yes and no. What we offer at Denver Health is specific educations. Oh, Henry wants to join in the conversation. Henry's my quirky. 1 second. So we actually offer in-person or virtual visits where you can go on, Henry. Learn whatever you want specific to that need. It could be that you need specific training for doctors. It could be that you need specific training on the process and the paperwork. So we're happy to tailor that. We can also just do one-on-one conversations with the doc. My medical director is awesome. She's always willing to talk with a new doctor, because if we're being honest, we are very busy and we love it when new doctors want to get involved with MAID. So we would be very happy to offer that education so that they feel supported. We're also happy to offer the additional support to patients and families because we know this is different. Like it's a different dying process. Families need a little bit different resources. So even if they don't use Denver Health, they're welcome to utilize me and my counseling services, or we're starting a bereavement group for people that have accessed MAID, their surviving loved ones. So we're happy to collaborate however that see fits.
Okay, thanks, Katie Sue. I see Linda has raised her virtual hand, and then there's a couple in the chat. So Linda, would you like to come off mute and ask?
Sure, thanks. So I'm wondering if about the payment and for the drugs, if someone orders the drugs and then they have the pharmacy hold the drugs, the medication, does the person have to pay for it if they don't end up using it?
Excellent question. I typically say if you're not ready to pick it up, don't offer payment. Our program waits until it gets picked up to charge the card. We just hold the card on file until the meds are actually picked up. So if you leave it there, you're safe. If you're using another pharmacy though, I can't guarantee that. So I always make sure to specify that question. But our program and many programs in Colorado are a pay as you go. So the cost of the first appointment for us is $125. The second appointment is $250, and then the meds themselves are $320. So you only pay for what you get. If you only have the first appointment, you only pay $124. Kind of nice. And meds, if you aren't ready to pick them up, fine. But if you do pick them up and it expires after 6 months, you will have to pay the $320 or whatever the cost is again.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Linda. And then in the chat, Robin is asking, when can you begin? Do you need to already have a diagnosis of 6 months or less?
Correct. So you cannot start the MAID process until you've gotten that prognosis of 6 months or less. Many people call our program with very serious illnesses of chronic pain, of diabetes, of things that will become terminal. But unfortunately, if they're not within that 6 month prognosis, which doctors don't ever know, you could live much longer or much shorter. We unfortunately can't start the process. So we are kind of stuck in that aspect. And then the other one I see is, so a person has to access hospice prior to accessing MAID. Yes and no. I'm the queen of yes and no, if you guys haven't figured that out already. We prefer patients to be on hospice. I recognize as a social worker who has been in the field, hospice is not an end all be all. There's a lot of room for improvement with hospice services, but the services they offer can be very supportive to patients and especially their families. And honestly, that's where I get worried is these families are holding so much that it's so nice to have a nurse coming in, a social worker coming in, or the meds, at least just the meds being shipped to the house instead of having to go out. So there are a lot of benefits. The other is that it also makes our job easier. It's really easy to say someone's within 6 months or less if they're already on hospice services. That means that a community provider and a hospice provider said they're within 6 months, and that makes our job really clean cut, which we love. There are exceptions. I understand that hospice isn't everyone's jam. I totally understand. So we do it on a case-by-case basis with our program. What we do is we just find out, why aren't you on hospice yet? And typically the answer is, I'm doing palliative chemo. I would lose my caregivers because they're covered by my insurance. And those are all very real options. So we get that. We do typically suggest going on hospice before ingestion day for the reason being, again, next of kin. When someone dies at home, if they're not on hospice, you have to call 911. That sucks. That is a lot of trauma for your family to have to go through and potentially your deceased body. That means that the police, the coroner, the ambulance, like all those lights have to come out. And after the day that they've had, it'd probably be nice for it to be a little bit softer. When someone dies on hospice services, it's considered an attended death. So if you're on hospice, fun fact, they don't have to be there for it to be an attended death. So if you want to take your MAID meds with your friends or family, you don't have to have anybody medical there. But because you're on hospice services, they do not have to call the ambulance, 911, or any of those things. The hospice nurse comes out, does the pronouncement, calls the coroner, and then you're released to the funeral home. So it's really, really gentle. And that's why I suggest getting on hospice before your ingestion day, just to make even that one tiny little aspect a little bit smoother for your loved ones. How can we find out who's involved in our state? I'm in Hawaii. It is legal in Hawaii. So you're definitely able to access it there. They do have a longer waiting period. I believe it's 20 days in Hawaii. But I would, again, go to acamaid.org, say that you're in Hawaii, you'll get connected. Every state usually has an end of life options volunteer group. Colorado just established one. I would definitely look it up, see if Hawaii definitely does have one. I just don't know what they're called. And they can offer support and resources and education related to your specific law. And then this is the last question I'll answer before going into the Death Day stuff. But it's a good one. I've seen some hospice bias against MAID. Have you had this experience? In Colorado, hospices are generally very open. I've had a lot of great interactions with hospices. They're very curious. And I think we've seen a huge kind of growth in people making their own policies. Because I think that's where the bias comes up, is that the hospice doesn't know what they're allowed to do. So they just throw their hands up and they're like, I don't want anything to do with it. And that's not always the case. So what a lot of my education, because I do individual educations with hospices, I love going to IDG. So if you're in hospice, invite me to your IDG. I'm a great time. But we just talk about, what are you comfortable with your nurses doing? What aren't you comfortable with your staff doing? And having that policy up front is not only helpful for the clinicians, but it's also helpful for the patient. So what hospices have started doing is putting their MAID policy in their intro packet, so that patients can flip through and be like, oh, great, my hospice does support MAID. That's awesome. Or I didn't even, what is MAID? And they ask that question and it opens a door, which is really nice. The biggest biases I've seen have been religious organizations, which is fine. They're allowed to opt out. I just always encourage patients to hospice shop before they, shop before you buy, if you will. Like, we Google what taco places to go to, but we never Google our hospice before we join. And it's like one of the most important services. So please research your hospices. Make sure that you find one that aligns with you and your needs. If you think that you even might want to do MAID, call the hospice and say, hey, does your organization support MAID patients, and or what is your policy? That way you can know, is the hospice allowed to be in the room when I ingest? Do they have to be outside of the house? Do they have to be called once you've deceased? Can they be brought back in once I've just finished the cocktail? Because all of these are different options that need to be talked about. And even beyond that, with the appointments, a lot of hospices have been helping me with the virtual aspect of the appointments. Surprisingly, technology is not always the most easy thing for some of our older patients or very sick patients to access. So the hospice is very gracious and they set up the appointment. Sometimes they use their computer because our patient doesn't have a computer, but it's important to make sure it's okay with your hospice before you do that. So before you offer to help with the appointment, make sure you know if you're allowed or not allowed to be a part of that appointment.
Wow. Thank you, Katie Sue. I'm just going to say thanks so you can take a couple breaths and move into the next portion. And thanks everyone for these really good questions. I know there's a lot of reasons that you may be here today, and it's a big topic. So appreciate your engagement. And now we'll let Katie Sue move on and talk about the day of ingestion, which I think just invokes a lot of curiosity, and let's kind of unveil the mystery a little bit.
Yes, let's unveil. I love questions. So thanks so much for asking all of those really important facts. But let's talk about what happens on the day. So you've jumped through the hoops, you've crossed all of the T's, you've dotted the I's, you've been prescribed the medication, and you're starting to think about, I think it might be time. Before we even get to the decision of what you're going to be on that day, I always tell people to make benchmarks. I think a common question is like, how do I know if I'm ready? And only you are going to be able to answer that question. You may never be ready. About a third of people that get prescribed MAID never take the medications. They just like the peace of mind that they're in control. So you may never want it, and that's okay. But I've seen some pretty interesting benchmarks in the past few years of, how do I know when my body is ready? And how do I know when I will be ready? So my favorite, it was my first person that I worked with that did MAID. She told me I will know that I'm ready for MAID when I don't enjoy my morning latte and I don't read the paper front to back. And it was a great benchmark because that day came, she called me and she's like, Katie, I didn't read the newspaper today. And I was like, okay, let's start planning. Let's figure out a date for your big day. And I thought that was really unique. You know your body and what your pleasures are. This is all about quality of life. It's called medical aid in dying, but it's all about enhancing your last days. We want you to have so many good days so that your loved ones and you, for whatever's next, don't have to remember so much suffering and pain and hardship. So it is really, really cool. Other benchmarks I've seen are a little bit more practical. The biggest one is not being able to toilet themselves. That sense of independence is really big for people. And once they get to a point of not being able to lift themselves or use the restroom, they feel ready. So you'll know your body. Those are some of the examples I've seen. But to talk about the day itself, this is, I think, the most powerful part of MAID. It's the activity that holds the most power. It holds the most closure for the person taking it and for the loved ones. It's this really unique gift where you have control over your last day and you can plan as much or as little as you want. And I think that's really cool. In this day and age of having a lot of traumatic and unpredicted death, it's really beautiful to have a gift of, this might be my last day. How can we make it as special as possible? Not to divert too much, but if you all watch The Last of Us, they depicted the last day of a MAID death really, really well. I loved everything about that episode. Ripped me apart. I was expecting zombies and like departure from my daily life, and I was like, wow, that just struck me right in the face. So it's really beautiful. It's an opportunity to pick out your favorite outfits, have your favorite people, eat your favorite food, and really have that closure with yourself or your people. So let's talk about it. You've decided on a day. I always tell you, pick a day that's significant for you. It's going to be a day that your loved ones remember. So it's fine to make it special. We had a patient who took his MAID meds yesterday who decided on March 13th at noon because his best friend, his dog, died 17 years earlier on March 13th at noon. And he just couldn't wait to be back with his dog. So that's the day and the time that he picked. And I thought that was really, really wonderful. And again, everything about this is about personalizing it to your needs and the needs of your loved ones. I always like to tell people, ask your people how they're feeling. They already have offered the most selfless gift by allowing you, which sounds weird, but they do have to let you in some ways go through this process. That in itself is really hard. It might be too hard for them to be there. Some people absolutely want to be there. So just make sure that you're offering that safe space to say, I understand if this is going to be too much. Once you've picked a day and once you have your attendee list, if you will, you can pick a place. So most people love MAID because you can do it in your home. It doesn't need to be in a medical facility. In fact, in most cases, it can't be. Most hospitals, most nursing homes don't allow you to take MAID on premises. If you do want to take it somewhere else, that is fine. The examples I have of that are people who have young children. They don't necessarily want to die in the house where their kids are, or they need kind of a safer place to have that moment. Other people, they live in skilled nursing homes and they aren't allowed to per the facility policy, so they have to move. But what I'll tell you, it has to be private property. It can't be a national park, a hotel, a community area. Anywhere that's public is really not okay. Just because this is such a sensitive topic and we are about reducing trauma. If you take it in a hotel, if you take it in a national park, that could create trauma for somebody else. And we really want to mitigate that. Plus it's the law. If you guys want, it's a really unique opportunity to open your space up. We are always looking for people who might be willing to host their home if you live in Colorado. And I can obviously talk more about that. I know we have people from different states. But just know there are options. You can take it in your home. If you live somewhere where it's not allowed, that shouldn't restrict you from accessing MAID. So always keep that in mind. If you do move, what I do tell people, I give them a checklist because when you're dying, your loved ones, they just want black and white. They want a checklist. So that's what I did. There's a checklist for a day of death. If you are moving, I always tell you coordinate with your hospice. Part of hospice's benefits is that they send the equipment that's needed to the home or wherever you're going to be. So they can send a hospital bed, a bedside commode, a little tabletop, bedside tabletop, whatever you need. What's nice is if you're at your home, this will already be here, which is kind of nice, but I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. If you're going to a different place or even just doing it in your home and you're the caregiver that doesn't live in the home, some of the things that you'll need to bring or go to Target or King Soopers are the following. So number one, the liquid mixer. As I mentioned, the medication is a little tiny powder, about a third of a cup of powder. You need to add 2 ounces of liquid to it. It cannot be dairy or carbonated. The most typical options people use are apple juice, Gatorade, orange juice. It is actually kind of encouraged to use alcohol, so margaritas and wine have been options. One guy really liked beer, and I told him it couldn't be bubbles, so we left it out overnight, so it was a flat beer, but he loved it. So it's really whatever you want. What we do say, though, is that this medication is extremely bitter. There are some pharmacies that are starting to play with the compound to make it less bitter, but it's still going to taste a little funkadelic. So we always tell people, try to keep that liquid mixture as cold as possible. We don't want it to be frozen. We really don't want you choking on ice chunks as you're drinking this medication, but make sure it's really, really cold so that it won't be as bitter when you're drinking it. The other thing I suggest you bring is a chaser, which sounds kind of goofy, but again, it's a very bitter medication that you're drinking. So we tell people to have sorbet, popsicles, honey, whatever the person likes the best, just at the bedside. Just enough to take a little spoonful to kind of cleanse the mouth so that the last thoughts aren't, wow, my mouth tastes kind of funny. Again, make sure it's not carbonated or dairy, so no ice cream, please. And then finally, what I tell people is think about who's going to be there. Sometimes this is a party and you have a lot of people there, but this process is unpredictable. We don't know how long it's going to take for your body to shut down. So make sure that you or your caregiver or whoever is help planning is bringing snacks and drinks for the next of kin. Sometimes if you're in a skilled nursing facility, there's no kitchen. So people sit there for hours and they're starving and they're thirsty and they're grouchy, and that could taint the experience. So you don't want to forget about the people sitting at the bedside. Make sure you're taking care of yourself so that you can, really be present for your loved one who is going through this dying process. Now that you have your go bag, we'll talk about preparing for ingestion. So we ask patients to stop eating 5 hours ahead of time. So a lot of people like to have a big breakfast. And then once they have that breakfast, they'll kind of start the clock to make sure that they're in a safe window of having digested everything they can. We do tell people to continue drinking fluids. We want them to continue taking meds, especially for anxiety and pain. There's no reason for your last day to be uncomfortable. Just make sure you're talking with your doctor. But we always encourage, if it makes you comfortable, please take it. Once you're getting closer, you'll take the pre-medications about 45 minutes ahead of ingestion time. So in Colorado, we offer 2 pre-meds. It's Reglan and Zofran. So Reglan helps with digestion. We want to be able to make sure that your body is absorbing these medications the best it can. And then Zofran is for nausea. A very common symptom of terminal illness and death is nausea. So we want to make sure your body is as settled as possible. That's also the reason for the no carbonation and the no dairy. We don't want anything bubbling in your body. So nice and smooth. After 45 minutes, I typically tell people use this time to say your goodbyes, and you'll have more time, but it's unpredictable. Once you take the meds, you can fall asleep very quickly, and that can be really hard if a family member was waiting for that moment. So I like to tell people, say it now, say it in this 45 minutes. If you haven't already, make sure you've said your piece, and then we can just hang out, and there's no pressure on those last moments if we can or can't say things before someone falls asleep. After you take the pre-meds, I typically say about 10 or 15 minutes before you ingest, use the restroom, just clean out anything that might be in there. As y'all know, when someone dies, there can be some elimination of bodily fluids. And that's usually it's a top concern for our patients. They're always worried about the bodily fluids. And I tell them it's not much at all, but if you are worried, use the restroom. We always tell people to have a chuck or a brief underneath them when they're in their comfy spot if they are really, really worried, but please don't worry about that. Once you use the restroom, settle into a comfy spot. It can be wherever you like. We do prefer somewhere where you can be propped up and then lay your head back eventually. So a lot of people do the hospital beds, their bed, a recliner chair. We had one gentleman who was sitting outside in his backyard in one of those like pool chairs. So whatever you like, that's totally fine. We do ask that you're propped up for the ingestion part just to make sure it's actually going down your esophagus. So make sure you have pillows or some way just to help your person sit up. And then once they're ready, you mix it in. What I like to tell people is that anyone can mix the medication. I think there's a lot of fear about the patient being strong enough to shake it up or open the bottles or do whatever that is. In Colorado, it's okay if your loved one is the one that mixes the medication. Typically, hospices don't allow their clinicians to mix the medicine just for their own liability. So keep that in mind. But anyone can do this. The patient doesn't have to be able to do that by themselves. Finally, again, this is a good time for another final goodbye because as the person drinks the medication, they might become sleepy very quick. So once the person is in their comfortable position, they have their cocktail, if you will. A lot of people just put a straw inside the old school pharmacy bottle because we do suggest throwing out the cup once you use it. If you do put it in a different cup for mixing purposes, don't stick it in the dishwasher. I don't need anybody else getting contaminated meds in their mouth or later on. So make sure you just dispose of it. But you can use a straw because a lot of people like straws for sipping when they're sick. What they'll do is they'll drink the medication steadily in 90 seconds or less. They can take breaks, they can take breaths, they can smile. It's not meant to be a chugging contest. It's meant to be just a rhythmic swallowing of this medication. It does taste a little icky, so we can take a break and have some honey. I think another important part is that the family can actually hold the glass. So if they have tremors, a lot of our patients have ALS or Parkinson's, so the family will hold the bottom of the cup and just hold it there for the patient, which is really nice. And then they use the straw. Once they've drunk the medication, the patient will fall asleep, typically in 5 minutes or less, into a deep, deep, deep sleep from which they will not wake up. So once they're in the sleep, they're not going to be waking up anymore. So once they've fallen asleep, we typically say to lean their head back to a comfortable position so that they're able still to get good airways, but they're not propped up so fully anymore. And then the waiting game begins. So what I'll tell people is this is a very interesting process. It can be very short. Some people die very quickly based on their age, their diagnosis, how their body absorbs medications. All of those things are factors. Younger people who have fairly healthy bodies are going to take a lot longer to die than someone who might be very, very sick with metastases everywhere. It especially goes quicker for people who are on high levels of oxygen or have heart failure, because that's what the medications aim to do. They slow the breathing and they slow the heart to a point of stopping. So for young people, we had a patient who was 26. It did take quite a while just because her heart and lungs were still really healthy. It was the rest of her body that was failing. So it's good to know there's a spectrum. But what you'll see is the expedited dying process. And I think this is really important for the caregivers to know because it's alarming. I think when we see normal death, I hate calling it normal death, but when there's not a MAID ingestion, you see the things very slowly, the changes in the body. Everyone loves Barbara Carnes, Gone from Your Sight, with the weeks and days and hours of all of those steady changes. You see all of those in a matter of minutes. And that's really hard for the body to comprehend. Even for me, it's still kind of surprising sometimes. I'm like, I just talked to them about how much we love Henry Butters, and now they're unresponsive and their body is changing. So it's important to remember it's going to happen very quickly. Some of the things you'll see when somebody takes MAID meds are, again, the classic dying processes, but the agonal breathing, the changes in body temperature, the hands and feet typically get cold very quickly. I also notice that some people run a little bit of a temperature in their head after they take MAID. There's a lot of changes in body color. So the modeling happens very, very quickly. You'll start to see like the bruising or kind of the purpley skin on the hands and the feet and the backside. There can be some gasping. I see quite often in older people with heart failure, they'll take like one big gasp, and then that's usually one of their last breaths. And it can be scary to see that gasp, but it's normal. And I think another hard couple ones are the twitching of the muscles. Again, as the body shuts down, our bodies are full of electricity. And as that electricity is shut off, there's still some signals that are happening. I had a patient recently, his arms, even after death, were still kind of twitching a little bit, which is very scary for a loved one to see their deceased father twitching a little tiny bit. But it's normal, and it's important to normalize that for yourself or for whoever you're caring for. And then the other one is the vacant eyes. That can happen very quickly, where they can fall into that deep sleep and their eyes might be shut for a little while, but then they might open up and they're looking upward, or they're not focusing anymore. Very normal. Again, as you all may know, when you die, muscles relax, and it's actually more muscles to hold your mouth and your eyes closed than it is to leave them open. That's why a lot of mouths are left open, and it's normal, but it can be hard to see. If you are worried about it and your person has, just stop their vitals at that point, you can put a little towel under their mouth to help their jaw sit, so it's not so intimidating if you have people coming to see them, but it is very normal. So again, I can't say it enough. Normal dying process, but it's very fast. So it's really, really hard, I think, especially for families. They've been planning for this day for months, maybe years, or their person has been sick for so many years. And to see them go from coherent to unresponsive and then deceased in a very short amount of time can be hard. So it's good to keep that in mind. What I'll say again is that there's a range. I think a lot of people hope they fall into this like little routine of like, I took the meds, I'm going to be asleep in 5 minutes, I'm going to be, deceased in 30 minutes. And that's not always the case. Some people die within 5 minutes, and somebody recently lasted 14 hours, and it's normal. But it's scary and it sucks if you're at the bedside because you don't know what to expect. So if you're at the bedside, always make sure that you're taking time for yourself. As you may know, people who are in the dying process actually appreciate alone time. So it's really important to give them that space. If they've been hanging on for a long time, walk out of the room, tell them you'll be back in 5 minutes, and give them that time to process whatever it is that might be going on in their body. So just always kind of keep tabs on yourself. And by doing that, you'll probably help your loved one who is dying as well. But it can be a long process. So take breaks, bring the hospice in for a shift if you want, leave your person alone. They are safe, they are comfortable, they're not going to toss and turn. One of the medications is actually amitriptyline, which stops the seizures. So they're not going to have any seizing activity, which is nice and safe. But it's just good to keep all of this in mind. All of that to say, I feel like those were all the scary parts of the ingestion. Let's talk about my favorite part. Once somebody ingests this medication, they're able to relax. They're able to fall asleep. One of my favorite stories is a lady who had, I believe she had ALS. It was just so advanced, and she had so many contractures, and her whole body was just stiff all the time. For years. And her husband said that, I can't hold her hand even because it hurts too bad for me to hold her hand. She took the meds and fell asleep. And that was the first time in 5 years or more that he saw his wife relax, and that he saw her arms relax, and he got to hold her hand for over an hour before she died. So in this space of expedited dying, you also get a really joyful gift of having this really peaceful exit, of having time to sit with death, to see it happen in a not so scary way. So while some of these things can be alarming for someone that might not be used to death, the symptoms that you do see are very graceful examples of the dying process. I have unfortunately seen a lot of suffering death, a lot of death that lasts for weeks. These always are gorgeous and graceful and soft, and that's what we want. That's what we want for people, is to have this soft exit if they want it. To just wrap up what happens after vitals have ceased, take your time. Take your time. There's no rush. Emily can probably be the first to tell you, like, there is no rush besides like the 24 hours, right? Is it 24 or 48?
Yeah, so that's such a good point, Katie Sue, on whoever you choose for end of life care. It's not an emergency. If you want to spend a few minutes or even a few hours with your loved one after they have passed, I know at Tree, we're happy to give you that space. The law is 24 hours
24.
that they must be either refrigerated or embalmed. So you have time.
You have time. And that's what I like to tell people. Some people don't like sitting with that, and I understand that is our society. But there's also some really cool things that can happen. It's a lot of, again, closure. I always feel like it's really beautiful to do postpartum care. It's honestly one of my favorite things to do with patients because it feels so precious. And it's time where you can do that. Again, this is a very unique death in that you get to choose what time that they do it. Granted, they might take it at noon and they pass at 11 o'clock at night, so it might be late. But for most patients, they do die in under 5 hours. So you're able to sit with them, you're able to provide that care. And I think it's really important to remember you have that allowance. There is no rush. Once you are ready, you can call hospice. If they're on hospice, if they're not on hospice, you will unfortunately have to call 911. And I do think there is a little bit more emergency to that one, but that's why I encourage having hospice on board. Typically, if hospice doesn't know that someone took MAID meds, it'll take them about an hour to arrive. If you told them ahead of time, they could be there already. So it could be a very easy process of doing the pronouncement. Another fun fact is that once hospice does the pronouncement, you can delay mortuary pickup. So the hospice can do their job and then they can leave, and then mortuary can come later on in the evening, and there's no rush for that. Once they come, they will pronounce the person, they will call the mortuary and the coroner to release the remains. It's important to note that for medical aid in dying, the cause of death is their diagnosis. Nowhere on the death certificate does it say medical aid in dying. So this is a natural death. It protects the person, it protects their privacy, and it protects their estates. It's good all the way around, which I think is nice. I think that's also a really good factor for reducing stigma, that we might be euthanasia or that this is suicide. This is neither. There's times and place for suicide and euthanasia, but medical aid in dying is just that. It's medical aid in dying, and it's a terminally ill person that will die regardless of having this med or not. So it gives them power in that moment. And then the mortuary will come. If they're Emily, they could be there really quickly. Sometimes it takes about 2 hours to get there. So again, I tell you this so that you can plan as next of kin or as the caregiver, that even though they may have died, it might be a few more hours before you feel comfortable leaving, but you also are not required to stay with the body. It is totally okay to leave the person. They are safe, they are happy, they're comfortable because they did what they wanted to. Just make sure whoever needs to has access to the house. You may need to be by to sign off, but if you're in a nursing home, it typically you can leave and it'll be okay. So keep that in mind. All of that to say, with 5 minutes left, I wanted to do a few calls to action, and then I'm happy to answer questions or stay even a few minutes after. Here are some of my calls to action for this evening after that whirlwind experience of learning about medical aid in dying. Is I would ask for donations to support patients. Medical aid in dying is typically an out-of-pocket expense. In California, it's covered by Medicaid, but in most other states, it's not. In Colorado, it's an out-of-pocket expense, and it's $800 for our program. For some people, that's not a lot, but for some others, it's a huge burden, and it actually is a barrier to access. So if you're interested, I believe that my program at Denver Health is the only one that accesses or has options for foundation, and we're able to pull from that foundation specifically for our MAID patients. So if you're interested, I'm happy to send you that link. We are dwindling in funds, and we have 3 patients next week that have asked for support financially. So please consider if you're willing to help some of these patients access MAID. The other call to action is to schedule a one-on-one with me. If you are just interested about medical aid in dying, about dying itself, about creative resources to personalize your death, I'm happy to be a resource for you. If you're not in Colorado, we are not accessing medical aid in dying, I do charge a consultation fee of $150, but I'm very happy to meet with you. If you're in Colorado and accessing MAID or thinking about moving to Colorado, that is free of charge. You call our program. My consultation is separate from the hospital, but we're happy to support you. There is no cost to understanding information about the Denver Health Medical Aid in Dying program. And then the final one is to host your home. If you live in Colorado and feel called to open your space to people who are accessing MAID that don't have a safe space otherwise, let me know. I would love to talk with you. We have a few places here in Denver, but there are people all over the state that need support. So if you're interested, I would love to talk more and give you that information. So with 3 minutes left, whew, my goodness, so sweaty. I would be happy to answer some questions.
Hey, yeah, it looks like Hannah has raised her hand. Do you want to come off mute?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm in Los Angeles. I'm a death doula, and I'm just so grateful that I found this. It's been so informative. I was always under the impression that that MAID was not really an option for people with Parkinson's or ALS because you had to ingest the medicine on your own without any help. Is that why you said specifically to just hold the bottom of the cup while they hold it? So they are technically like, that feels like a gray area.
It's a gray area. So here's the other gray area that I'm so glad you asked this question. There are multiple ways to ingest the medication. For somebody who has been sick for a long time, they commonly have PEG tubes or G tubes. The MAID medications can be inserted via those tubes. And honestly, it's one of the most graceful because usually it's just the gravity bag or it's a plunger that we plunge the meds into, and they just have to have the strength to push it. Some people use their faces, some people use their arms, but it's a really wonderful way if their swallowing is not up to par anymore. I also know a lot of people with Parkinson's, PSP, all of these kind of terrible esophageal cancer, they can't swallow anymore. And they haven't chosen to do any of those invasive surgeries like G tubes or PEG tubes. So it is an option to do a rectal administration. So we typically ask that the doctor be there. With our program, our doctor and myself, we go out and she helps with the insertion of a catheter. And then the patient just plunges it via a syringe plunger into the catheter. It's very discreet. It's very dignified. So people are a little worried about that one, but it's an excellent option for somebody who can't swallow anymore. So those are the two options, and or they're welcome to have somebody hold it while they drink from a straw, because that is okay too. I would say that oral administration is typically the preferred way. It's the least fuss. But I also know that, you know, just because you can't swallow anymore and you have full function of your brain shouldn't eliminate your access to MAID.
Thank you, Katie Sue. It looks like Shawnee is asking for witnesses, does a death doula count as your healthcare team?
It depends. If you are working with them as a hospice provider and doula, no. But if you are only there in the space as a death doula with a private contract, that is fine. A death doula can be a witness, and many of the volunteers here in Colorado are witnesses. I typically try to keep that a little bit more delineated. If possible, find 2 other people, but it is allowed and it is fine. But just, you know in your gut if it feels weird, like, ooh, this is not so good one since I'm their primary caregiver. But others, you're doing more consultations, you're doing more of the pre-planning, and I'd say it's definitely safe for you to be the witness.
Thank you. Yeah. Wow. That's an interesting question. Danielle asks, do you have resources or information about how to advocate for MAID in a state without current access? I am a hospice nurse in Massachusetts and have identified a huge interest in this from my clients.
Yes, Danielle, we'd love to see it. I would suggest becoming a volunteer for Compassionate Choices. I'm a volunteer and educator for them. They're the largest nonprofit nationwide dedicated to helping end-of-life options. That goes beyond MAID. They do advocacy for VSED. They advocate for the dementia provision. So if you have dementia, you cannot typically access medical aid in dying, but they have an advanced directive that helps you have more grace. So they are huge in legislation. They are consistently lobbying in states without MAID. I know that Massachusetts is actually introducing a bill. So they're always looking for people on kind of the field level to tell the stories, because that's what the legislators want the most. They want those heartfelt stories of people that suffered unnecessarily because it wasn't an option in their state. And I think it's so silly that a medical procedure is determined by zip code. That could be said for a few things in this country right now, but I definitely support your advocacy and can definitely hook you up with, I think Compassionate Choices has their own chapter in Massachusetts. So check them out.
Wow, thank you. That's so good to know that that's available in other states as well, that the Compassionate Choices organization. Okay, wow. I think we covered so much this evening.
Woo!
This was
Good shower.
amazing. Uh, really, really appreciate everyone who showed up. There is an email going out after this, about 7:30 tonight is when you'll get an email following up. And in that email, there is a link for you to be able to set up time one-on-one with Katie Sue. I know I have a feeling there's a lot of death workers in this space, whether you're a nurse or a doula. I just want to acknowledge the fact that we often in the death care world do a lot of unpaid education and labor. So that link is going out, and if you do want to, utilize more of Katie Sue's time, then that's a way to do that. And then if you also have a space available for folks who may be able to use MAID and need a place where they can ingest some medication, her contact information is in that email as well. Is there anything that you would like to finish up with, Katie Sue?
No, I am just so happy to be here. I love meeting new people. The only way we're going to change this law is by continued advocacy. There's even things to change for our Colorado law. So if you're passionate, let me know. We're just thankful to be here. And if the cost of the one-on-one is prohibitive, please just let me know. I feel you. I'm a social worker. Sliding scale is totally fine. And if it's MAID related, we can go through Denver Health. But just thank you so much for being curious. And I hope that you all can, serve somebody else a little bit more comfortably going forward, and happy to be here. You can follow me on the Insta if you want. I do MAID Mondays. Mostly features my dog. So if you want to see more of this little nightmare, you're welcome to follow us at Katie Sue VV. This is Henry. He says, I don't want to be here.
Yes, we love Henry Butters. Oh, thank you, Katie Sue, so much for your time this evening and all this generous information. And thanks for everyone who came. Please do stay in touch with us. Let us know how we can support you. And thanks for being here. Everyone have a wonderful evening.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.